Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. Today we are very fortunate to have two guest speakers, Dr. Rachel Amey and Dr. Andrew Slaughter from the U.S. Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences. I had to cheat and look at the sheet for that. They're here to discuss ARI's research mission, how they're working towards driving scientific innovation to enable the Army to acquire, develop, employ, retain professional soldiers, enhance personal readiness, as well as talk about opportunities with the Department of Defense funding. Their research interests overlap our college's research interests quite a bit. And for those of you who remember Sherry Vale, she used to have quite a bit of DoD funding and had a really good experiences working with DoD on many of her funded projects. So with that, I will turn it over to Drs. Amey and Slaughter.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So we'll see. Okay, so first of all, thanks for the introduction. And just for a little bit of background about myself, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, like a lot of people at ARI, but we do have a big mix of people. You know, we have anthropologists and neuropsychologists, and just a little bit of something about me is I actually did my undergraduate here. So yeah, about 25 or 30 years ago. But so it's nice to be back. It looks very different. So I don't know if you want to just say.
Yeah, sure. Hi guys, my name is Dr. Rachel Amey. I'm a research psychologist at the Army Research Institute. I am one of the non-IO psychologists in our unit. I do a lot of cognitive and neuroscientific methods and a lot of social psychology when it comes to the topics that we'll be talking about today. I also have a very strong quantitative background, which, especially when we get to our unit in particular, has a lot of applications. So we pull psychologists from all over the place. Basically, it's not just a IO thing necessarily.
No,
yeah,
not anymore. Or tried very, very hard to get away from
yes,
that.
yeah.
And just in terms of my own research topics, most of my work in the past has been in terms of statistical analysis of social networks and individual differences. So, okay. So what I want to do right now is just start talking by a little bit of background about what the Army is trying to do in some of the personnel research space, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what our unit within ARI is doing. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about just kind of ARI as an institution, to try to give you guys sort of a bird's eye view of some of the different areas of research that we support. Okay. So what's the Army doing in terms of talent management? Well, most people know that the Army's like really big, but I actually checked these numbers last night, and as far as I can tell, we're the third largest employer in the U.S.
It's a massive number of people.
Like between the active duty reserves and Guard, like there's almost 1 million people, and that doesn't count the DoD civilians. Yeah, and like 450,000 active duty people alone, and there's a lot of turnover, with people going in and out. So the Army, especially out of all the different services, we have a big need to try to do a good job with selection, retention, assignment, things like that. Now in the past, I will be politic and say that maybe the Army hasn't done the best job it could have done in terms of some of those things. The Army traditionally has had sort of a very, square peg, square hole sort of approach to assignment. So, the idea was, people have, like you get a certification, you have a certain position in the past, and as long as you have those minimum qualifications, you're assumed to be competent and ready for a position, and, they'll just throw you into the position. And there wasn't much thought given into kind of, person organization fit, person job fit, those sorts of things. Trying to really maximize the match between the individual's capabilities, interests, attitudes, and the needs of the job. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in the Army, that the Army is making a big effort to try to do, is to try to get a more modern talent management approach. And I actually don't like the word talent management, it's sort of like buzzword, but trying to get modern personnel practices, the kind of things that companies have been doing for 20 years. And of course, trying to change the Army is like trying to steer a ship. It's not. Okay, so this kind of gives an overview of sort of how the Army's thinking about personnel research has sort of evolved from World War I on. So ARI actually grew out of an office that started in World War I were involved in the development of things like the first standardized tests, so things like the Army Alpha. So you guys, when you had to take the GRE, we're sort of responsible for that, and I apologize.
Sorry.
Yeah. So the Army early on focused on kind of very narrow sets of things, like cognitive ability tests. Like, do you have a sufficient level of cognitive skills to just make it as an infantry person, follow orders? That was the main concern. There wasn't a lot of worries about fit, or other things. But as time has gone on, the Army's done a better job of trying to get at more individual differences. So it wasn't until like the mid-2000s that the Army actually decided to implement personality testing. So we've known for years that things like conscientiousness and personality characteristics can be really important for jobs. The Army for a while was talking about can-do factors, cognitive ability, skills things, and will-do factors, motivational, cognitive. And so what we're trying to move towards nowadays is contextualizing some of those factors more. So trying to figure out what is it about specific positions that a job requires? What is it about the social context that people are operating in? What is it about the team or group or organizational context? And how do we try to select people that will be the best fit for those things? The idea that hopefully will maximize performance, hopefully will maximize job satisfaction, things like that. Hopefully. Okay. So the Army's trying to do that by taking a more data-focused approach than it has in the past. Now, traditionally the Army has had a lot of data. I mean, like a lot of data. But the trouble is it's all been stovepiped. So each little organization in the Army has had its own file cabinets, You've heard of the file drawer problem for meta-analysis? The same thing with Army organizations. And so anytime you wanted to get some data, you couldn't. The organizations, they fight against each other. Like, I want to get some data from you. So the Army's, starting probably over 10 years back, has made a big effort to try to get rid of those stovepipes. And one of the things that we've finally managed to do is actually get it so that there's some centralized repositories for the Army. So that now a lot of personnel data, some organizational data, not as much as I'd like, flows into central repositories, and operations researchers can use that, and scientists like we can access that. Well, we're trying to access it.
We're trying to access it.
Yeah.
It's one of the things we're trying to solve.
Yeah. But anyway, so the Army has made some big advances in terms of starting to make data more available. It's still not quite there, but it's much better than it was. Another thing the Army's trying to do is move towards better use of things like assessments. So, the Army famously has used assessments for, some enlisted person wants to come in, they take the ASVAB. But, there aren't really assessments for officers. There aren't really, regular or, specialized assessments necessarily throughout someone's career to try to figure out, which positions they should go into, although we're starting to do that now, and the ARI supports some of that. So, we're trying to lay the groundwork for making kind of a culture of assessment so that we can both get more data and hopefully get better information that we can use to make personnel decisions. And by the way, the DoD is famous for terrible graphics. I did not make that.
Say something about the slides in general. We have a kind of standardized approach to how we present. So I will apologize in advance. Our slides are very busy. We're going to highlight certain aspects of each slide. But one of the reasons we do like to put all the information here is that, at the end of the day, especially when we talk about funding and our lines of work, you guys have all the information you need. So I did want to just point that out very briefly.
So don't feel like you have to read every word on these slides,
please
because
focus on
I wouldn't try myself.
Yeah.
Actually, there used to be a Twitter account called Bad DoD Slides.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that one.
It's like a running joke, but for those of you who may not have seen a DoD or Army presentation before, it can be a little bit jarring, and you may be thinking, what the heck, they should know how to give a presentation. But here we are.
If you know Edward Tufte's work, it's like they took everything about his work and just inverted it. Yeah.
Yep. So just want to put that out there.
Yep. Okay. So as an example of one of the things that the Army's doing and that ARI is involved with right now, one of those things is trying to create sort of a common language that can be used for organizing data and for thinking about assessments and for thinking about selection and assignment. And one of those things that more recently we've been working on is something called the Army Talent Attribute Framework. Now, I don't know how many of you here are familiar with ONET. Like I know. Okay, yeah. So the Department of Labor, they used to have something called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and it became something called ONET. It's basically a huge compendium of knowledge, skills, and abilities that are mapped onto different jobs. The old joke for the Dictionary of Occupational Titles used to be that if it's not in the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, it's illegal. And ONET is sort of the foundation of doing job analysis for companies. So when you have a position, you want to go hire a public affairs person, you can go to ONET and you can say, oh, these are the skills that are required for the job. Maybe you can customize it for the local conditions. But you have some foundation to start with. From you're trying to decide what skills does a person need, what personality characteristics, that sort of thing. And there wasn't anything like that for the Army for a long time. You could sort of take ONET and sort of splint and say, okay, maybe these kind of officers need these things, but what this is providing sort of a framework that's more specific to the military that is like ONET. So we can say, here are the lists of knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we can start to do job analyses for officers, for enlisted, to say, okay, yeah, a signals officer needs to know these things, needs to have these sort of abilities. We actually have some interest from some of the other services in adapting this thing. So with the Coast Guard, and I think we've been talking to the Navy. Yeah. Although I assume they're not going to call it the Army Talent Attribute Framework.
Probably not. They'll probably come up with another acronym.
Yeah. Okay. So that's sort of like the near-term stuff. More long-term, the Army and ARI are focused on a number of different areas. I'm not going to talk about all these things, but at a very high level, it's things like finding better ways to get data. So, we do a lot of surveys in the Army, and soldiers tend to be over-surveyed. And the response rates are frankly terrible. After grad school, I worked for a consulting company for several years, and one of the things that company did was they had phone banks where they did political surveys and stuff like that. They would get response rates of 30 or 40% cold calling people during dinner. We get about 10%. It's really lousy. So making a lot of these decisions about personnel practices, about organizational practices, it depends on having good data. And so one of the things that we're focused on is finding ways to get at that data through things like adaptive survey sampling, through things like unobtrusive measurement. So can we get data and measurements without giving people surveys? We're also interested in things like more advanced manpower planning models. So the Army, they need to figure out how many linguists do we need 5 years from now. And they have these giant complicated models, but they're kind of like industrial age models. They're predicated on people in, people out, manpower flows. They don't take into account anything about individual differences, very little about labor economics, that sort of thing. And so one of the things we're looking at is how can we bring in some of the social and behavioral science into improving some of these predictive models so that we can do a better job of, say, answering counterfactual questions about if the labor market changes this way, how will that affect the number of linguists that we have? Or, if we recruit from different pools of people, how will that change the face of the Army 10 years from now? And we're also interested in advances in learning and things like that. Okay. Now, for the Army at least, the main people who are working on a lot of those things, at least from a research standpoint, a scientific standpoint, is ARI, us. The DoD has a lot of research labs. I think we may be the very last research lab that focuses entirely on social and behavioral science. Most of the other research labs tend to focus on, material science, developing new armor and chemical compounds, or computer science and information technology. And some of the labs, the Air Force, they do support behavioral science research, but they tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused. So things like situational awareness, for the Air Force. But the Army, because again we employ 1 million people, are more broadly focused in terms of social and behavioral science. You can basically think of the work that we do as applied social, psychology to a large extent. Okay. Now we have a couple of different units. We have a couple of different research portfolios. I'm going to talk a little bit about the portfolios just at a very high level. So one of the areas that we support is a basic research program. And our basic research program is essentially like a little mini NSF, except it's focused on personnel and organizational topics. Now I'm not going to talk about these areas in detail, but our basic research program supports research into areas like measurement, so developing new psychometric assessments, or developing new mathematical, like item response theory models, things like that. We also have a large program that we support on kind of organizational dynamics, so it is like behavior in collectives, things like that. So in teams, in small groups, in larger collectives, trying to understand like the spread of attitudes, collective behavior. Our basic research program also supports research in learning and development, so like skill acquisition. Okay. I'm going to skip over that. We can come back to that later if we want. Okay. In terms of our applied research portfolios, one area that we support is research on leadership competencies. So how do we identify what competencies leaders need? How do we assess those? And how do we develop them? Okay. Another portfolio we do a lot of work in supporting is team assignment performance. So how do we optimize team performance? If we have like a squad of people, or if we have a pilot crew, like how do we optimize the performance of that group, especially over like say longer missions. And more recently we've been focusing a lot on team assignment and team assembly. So say you've hired 20,000 new people, like you've recruited 20,000 new people. How do you optimally assemble them into squads of 12? That's actually a very hard optimization problem, just from a pure mathematical standpoint. But we're supporting research on things like that. So one of our newest portfolios that we have is, I didn't come up with the acronym, it's called TSAVI, but it's basically soldier technological fluency. So as soldiers are having to deal with a lot more things in terms of like interfaces and radios and whatnot, in computer systems, how do we make sure that we're identifying people who are going to be good at those things? Or if we can't identify people who are already good at those things, how do we train them to be? So we're supporting research onto just trying to identify what is technological fluency for a soldier. How do we assess it? How do we develop it? Okay, our last major portfolio, which is probably core to a lot of what ARI has done, at least traditionally as an organization, is personnel assessment. And this is really classic industrial organizational stuff, like bread and butter, developing assessment. So like, developing new measures of cognitive ability and personality, developing new measures of, vocational interests, things like that. And then finding ways to deliver those efficiently. So this research program involves things like developing algorithms for computer adaptive testing, so we can get maximum information with kind of the minimum number of items. Excuse me. Okay. Well, that ended quickly.
Well,
so I'm going to let
I'll take
Rachel
over
talk
from
about
here. So just to let you guys kind of marinate on all that information kind of while I'm talking, we will be talking about our broad agency announcement afterwards, which is currently open.
Yeah.
So if any of you guys have research that kind of falls in line with a few of the things that Andy spoke about, we'll be talking about that at the end. I know we skipped over the slide in the moment, but I wanted to just touch on that to make sure you guys knew we didn't forget about it. We have some people interested in that. So yeah, I'll take over for now. We'll be talking about the Predictive Analytics and Modeling Research Unit, which is Andy and my unit. He is a team leader. For our unit, I am a research psychologist. So we're really excited to talk about a few of the actual research applications that we've been doing to kind of address a few of the needs that Andy has been talking about. So to give you guys a little bit of a background, again, Future Talent Management has really been arguing for ways to source valid, cost-effective, and reliable, and importantly, timely assessments. Our soldiers are really bombarded with a lot, not only the stress of their job, but I did a few data collections last year, and the last thing they want to do is take an assessment. So that's where we come in to really try to find out ways to efficiently get the data we need to run the models and to test the theories, quite frankly, that we have. So the purpose of our unit is, again, to develop these measures, and we've come up with a few cool products and research lines over the past few years that we'll be talking about today. So for example, we've been leveraging existing data, like archival data, for prediction models, so who might perform better in certain situations, who is more likely to be retained in a job, who might be more likely to learn a certain new skill. So as you can see, when we talk about these types of products, there's a lot of psychological ties here. It's not just, again, that IO aspect of it. We're also looking at innovative methods to generate new types of analyses for our job analysis. And this allows us to be more efficient when we're trying to conduct this type of work. We've also been doing the automatic generation of items and assessments. So that's kind of almost like every professor's dream, right? You have a new assessment you need to do for a certain criteria of your students, and you put in some material and out comes an amazing, valid exam. Well, we do that for the Army. And then we're also doing a lot of predictive modeling for soldier performance in particular. So we're really interested in that training and development aspect and how we can accurately predict who can retain and learn that information the best. And another thing we're really interested in doing is, like a lot of academic work, improving traditional approaches. And this becomes a little bit more profound when we take into consideration the context that Andy talked about. We have a lot of people pressed for time. When we think about traditional job requirements and job analysis, it's much like qualitative data. Does anyone here work with qualitative data? Yeah, I see some hands raised. You know it's very time consuming, right? We get some data, we have to have coders, we have to code it, we have to validate it, and you're often limited in the time and also the amount of data you can collect. And that can be limiting not only in your results, but also the distribution of those findings. So job analysis is very similar. So one of the things we've been really trying to streamline is the job analysis process. And we've been doing a lot of text analysis with this in natural language processing. And we've also been applying these methods to assessment development to streamline that process, make it more efficient, more valid, so we can have better assessments faster to get the data we need to run these prediction models. So like I said before, one of the main techniques we've been using recently is something called natural language processing, or NLP. Are people familiar here with NLP? Awesome, I see some heads nodding, but I'll give a definition and keep everyone on the same page. So it's a range of computational techniques for analyzing and representing naturally occurring text at one or more levels of linguistic analysis for the purpose of achieving human-like language processing and for many, many applications. And we use NLP all the time. If you wrote an email this morning or searched in Google or texted your friend and predictive text came up, that's natural language processing. And we've been kind of using these applications for the Army in particular. But why would we even want to use natural language processing, especially in the military? Well, we have a few unique problems. Qualitative data can be really rich when we collect it from soldiers. This can be transcripts, notes, open-ended survey items. But one thing that's really positive about it is a time saver in one sense. Sometimes we are limited in our surveys with perhaps the number of items we can give soldiers. And then another no-brainer, well maybe no-brainer, but Andy and I are civilians, and we're doing work that's supposed to apply to enlisted soldiers. Those are two completely different worlds. Oftentimes, we don't actually know the questions to ask the soldiers to get the responses we need. So when we give them qualitative natural language prompts, we can often get a lot of information that, quite frankly, we didn't even think of in the first place. But this presents a challenge. It's hard to process and analyze at scale. We have issues of accuracy and reliability of human coders. There's ultimately a ceiling of how many research assistants, for example, we can train, and making sure that they're doing them in a focused environment. Granted, there's ways around that, but that's more time and effort that, quite frankly, we don't have. But we're finding that utilizing these processes has actually been really, really helpful in that domain of job analysis. So again, just for basic definitions, job analysis is the process of systematically gathering, documenting, and analyzing information about a job. So this can be really helpful for understanding its duties, responsibilities, and it's really important for kind of just the foundation of ultimately an HR system. We need to know aspects about a job and who can complete that job for all parts of the personnel system, including things like recruitment and retention. And also, this is from Army documentation, we say it almost every day, we need to get the right person and the right job at the right time. So job analysis is really important for that. But it's really challenging, especially in the Army, because as we mentioned a few times, the Army is massive. We have jobs of people actually going into battle, and we have jobs of people sitting behind a computer and doing data analysis. We can't just send out an Army-wide survey and say, hey, what do you do for work? It's going to be very context poor and not help us with what we need to figure out. And although we can use these mixed method approaches, we run into the same issues with code error and bias, and we kind of need a different analytic approach to kind of solve this problem. So when we use natural language processing to kind of apply to job analysis, we hit a few nails on the head here with solutions. So again, we need something that's scalable, we need something that can be quickly deployed, and we need something that's also flexible, so we can pick up on that nuance in the context of soldiers in these different environments. So additionally, to gather the data to even think about those issues, we need traditional surveys, we need open-ended text items, we need Army documentation, there's lots of that. And common methods like archival data can also be a good source. But again, if we think about this in the traditional approach, that's not doable. But when we apply natural language processing, especially standardized approaches, we can do all of this very quickly and get some really nuanced results, which I'll show pretty soon. Go ahead.
And so one of the other applications that that we have been developing along with these things is how do we do job analysis for jobs that don't exist yet?
Mm-hmm.
So a few years ago we didn't have drone operators, and soon we'll have swarm operators once we have swarms. But and so how do we decide what the job requirements are for those jobs that haven't even been developed yet?
Yeah.
And so we're experimenting with techniques related to natural language processing and other things to try to help us make guesses at starting points for identifying what those job requirements might be for different types of jobs that we can only give broad parameters for. And so that's just kind of one of the other things that we're doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, especially because right now one of the issues we're dealing with, and Andy brought this up in his slides, is the changing nature of warfare. We have so much technology now that our soldiers weren't initially trained to use. It's kind of put a cog in the wheel, so to speak, of making sure that we can get this training up to date. So all of these applications are really helpful for that kind of thing. So one of the ways we've been dealing with the job analysis in NLP is by using topic modeling, which I'm assuming a lot of you in the room now know. I saw some head nods, that's great. So what is topic modeling? It treats basically natural language text as kind of a mixture of latent topics. It's almost like a factor analysis, so to speak. So what it can do is actually find latent topics within each individual word within the natural language text and group them. So we've actually been using a technique called latent Dirichlet allocation, or LDA, to try to understand when we have a massive corpus of text, what is the important information that we should pull out of that. So I'm going to give you guys an example of that in the next slide. So this was actually part of a piece of work that I did with one of my colleagues. It's currently under review in our internal department. And what we basically asked was, we asked a bunch of officers in varying ranks, what are the most important tasks for your job? We gave them 10 blank boxes. They could fill in as much or as little as they wanted. So importantly, I also want to talk about the scale of this project. We surveyed hundreds of people. So we had a text blurb for hundreds of people.
Well, this is from the Army workshop.
Yeah.
That was 5,000 people.
Yeah, yeah. It was a lot of people. And I will say we actually did this analysis just to show you how much time we're saving in an afternoon. So if we did that with human coders, we would not have been able to do this. So that's one of the main takeaways from this.
And I mentioned that the Army's always had a lot of data. So the Army's done surveys for a million years, and they've always had open-ended response boxes. Traditionally, those just get ignored because no one has the time to sit down and go through them. So this is actually probably one of the first times I've ever seen the Army do a large-scale survey where we're actually able to dig into the response options, meaningfully.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So what we were able to do is actually run a latent deer-site allocation topic model on this to pull out the main duties that these soldiers were conducting. And the first thing we found was, lo and behold, as you can see on the slide, I have a slide, so that's good, right? It was able to actually extract some of the most important tasks for each of those officers' jobs. But interestingly, it also extracted topics that we didn't really expect to come out. So it was providing nuance depending on how we looked at the data, and I'm going to show you that on the next slide. So for example, when we look at different variables, mind you, all these people have on paper, a very similar job that has similar duties. But when we look across things like leadership, we can see the actual things that they're doing every day changes. So for example, new leaders, we can clearly see that they have jobs that are maybe require a little less responsibility, I think I can say. So for example, we're managing school attendance over here. But when we go up to senior leaders, they are doing much more responsibility heavy things like overseeing training centers and actually conducting major training operations. But why this is so important is because when we go back to Andy's context, we're thinking about person-job fit and the individual knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes we need for these soldiers to perform these jobs. So if we go off the basic job description, we might be missing a few pieces of information that when we run analyses like this are exposed. So by utilizing NLP on this type of natural language that we were able to get, we were really able to provide insight into the other attributes to these jobs.
Yeah, and one other way that we're using NLP and machine learning for this sort of area is if you look at, say, the duties that are there, and we have some specific duties that we, as well as like the imputed ones here. But I mentioned the ATAF earlier, the knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so one of the things we need to do is be able to map on, what are the duties that an individual has in a certain position to those knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we can decide on what assessments we need to develop, what training classes we need to develop. And so one of the things we've been doing is using things like machine learning to say, take those duties and then use them to predict which one of the KSPs or knowledge, skills, and abilities from the ATAF, should be associated with those things. And since we have 195 KSAs, having individuals code those by hand is not easy. So machine learning is actually very helpful for that. Sorry.
Yeah, oh, it's okay. You took some time, so it was perfect. It's okay. So Andy, he got the first one, fantastic, thank you. But it also helps us ultimately, again, write those better job descriptions, extract those job requirement information, those KSAs. I know we're switching between acronyms a little bit. The Army is currently transitioning between them, so I apologize again.
Yeah.
But
most of industrial psychology calls them KSAs or KSAOs. The Army, just to be different, decided to call them KSPs for knowledge, skills, and behaviors. And
you can think of them as individual differences.
Yeah. So if our tongues get confused, I apologize.
It's okay. I just wanted to point that out for them.
The job description bullet there is actually kind of an interesting one because the Army has sort of internal marketplaces where if a new officer or if an officer, when they are ending a rotation, they have to decide what's the next position I should go for. Should I go be a signals officer over here? Should I go for company command over there? Something like that. And so units, they write their position descriptions to say, this is what you'll be doing. There is a huge amount of variance in those position descriptions. Some of them are like half a line that says nothing about what someone will be doing. Others are like, longer paragraphs that are actually kind of complete. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're using NLP and some other techniques to create tools to help units write useful job descriptions, so that some enlisted person who knows nothing about personnel psychology or HR or anything like that, can have some tools that will give them a decent starting point to write a useful position description, so that when some officer has to decide, should I move my family across the country or to Japan or wherever, they have a little bit of useful information. So that's kind of one of the tool projects that we're
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I do not have that on the slide. So that was good. So another application we actually have is assessment development. So we've been applying natural language processing to assessment development. But we already kind of went over a few of these aspects, so I'll breeze over this a little bit quicker. Assessments are absolutely key to personnel systems, and they're also key in generating the data we need to, again, run these predictive models that we need. They help us match people to jobs, they help us identify training needs, in addition to just evaluating the effectiveness of our training and our programs. But a lot of challenges are, making these tests takes a lot of time. Very similar to our qualitative data issue. We also currently have a lot of smaller item pools. So the best way I can relate to this is if you are if you're giving out a final exam, but you use the same one from before, and somehow the students got that final exam, that's no longer a valid assessment. We have the same thing in the Army. So we need more test security, we need larger item pools to make sure that when we do assess our soldiers, especially to a certain criteria, which is very, very common, it's valid and up to date. And currently, job assessment development is very slow. So it requires experts, takes a lot of time, validation, and often, unfortunately, we find ourselves chasing our tail because once we're done creating an assessment, the material already changed, and we have to do it all over again. So solutions like natural language processing really, really helps us do this. So this specifically helps us identify content areas for assessments, and we can take that from, for example, Army documentation. We are also able to generate items on the fly. So even for a quick training and development purpose, we can generate kind of knowledge check questions. One of my favorite aspects of this is actually predicts the psychometrics of the new item. So we can actually have a validated assessment automatically generated, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, and by the way, some of these things, you might look at them and think like, oh, ChatGPT, it'll make it easier. But we actually started this program of research before, the large language models existed. So, we're transitioning and making use of some of those things. But, this line of research came before that was even a possibility.
Yeah. And just to kind of add on to that, that's a great point. This is not ChatGPT.
No.
I would love it if we could use ChatGPT. That would make our job a lot easier. But Army data is very secure. We actually can't use these cloud-based systems. So a lot of the models we're going to be talking about were actually kind of built in-house, which I think is a really cool development that we've been able to work on. And we're also working on automated scoring, which I think is like every professor's dream, right? You give an exam, we get the scores, and that helps us with criteria and understanding how our soldiers are developing. So one of the projects we actually just wrapped up, we're starting the second phase at the moment, is one that develops assessment items using actually the semantics of natural language text rather than the syntax. So this is pretty important because when we think about natural language processing, we can do things by capitalization, punctuation, or we can actually use the actual syntax, or I'm sorry, the semantics of the text at hand. So this project actually used something called FrameNet, which is something out of UC Berkeley. It's a big natural language processing package that maps something called semantic frames. And we can think of a semantic frame as kind of a little tiny package of information that we find relevant. So there's different frames for different purposes. So for example, this one right here is a giving frame. It's really interested in the person or the situation, the item that's actually being transferred to another person, and the recipient or the outcome. So you can see here when we take, and I know this is a very high level overview, but when we, when we take 4 different sentences that convey the same information, when we apply this giving frame to it, we always have John giving the book to Mary. So we always have the donor in the right spot, we always have the recipient in the right spot, and we always have the theme in the right spot, depending on whether you say John gave the book to Mary or the book was given by John to Mary. This algorithm is able to extract that information accordingly. Just to give you some other examples of semantic frames, one in particular I'm going to be talking about in depth is tool purpose. It really allows you to extract information that's relevant for your objective. And in this case, it's assessment development. So how do we do this? So when we put this together, we are able to extract frames from Army material. And I know this is kind of a dry example, but I think it's a really clear-cut way of describing how this actually works. So say we put in the instructional material and it says round nose pliers are used for making screw loops and working in limited space areas. Great. When we apply this tool purpose frame, we're able to extract that round nose pliers, that is the tool, and its purpose is for making screw loops. And importantly, when we feed it this instructional material, we're not just talking about round nose pliers, we're talking about other tools, a screwdriver maybe, or a hammer, and other kinds of tools and their purposes. So what's so great about this approach is that when we extract those frames, we can actually generate stems and answers from those frames. And the one really unique aspect of this approach that we have been utilizing really heavily in the Army is its ability to generate distractors, which is actually really tough in assessment development, because we can't have things that are too easy, can't have things that are off topic, and we also can't have things that are too close to the answer, almost like a double answer. So when we take this approach, not only do we get the question, what is the purpose of round nose pliers? The answer is to make screw loops. We also are getting really accurate distractors from other outcome frames of the purpose from other tools that were mentioned. So we had a tool that would anchor screws or identify hot wires or attach electrical devices. So when we use this to make a multiple choice exam, we get really good questions, really good distractors automatically. So we literally have a bank of questions that we can just pull from depending on the material that we feed it. So some other things or notable results from this type of technique is that although programming those frames in the beginning from source material is, when we model them, a little bit costly in terms of time, but it's kind of a one-time upfront cost. So for example, right now we're working on transitioning this to actually an Army schoolhouse. We're working with them right now to kind of get their material into the system so that we can produce these questions for them. It's a one-time cost, but then the schoolhouse can actually use these assessments for years to come. And they only require, updates whenever material might change, for example. It also gives us opportunities to develop and improve theories around distractor items. Human item review is still necessary with this technique, but again, we're really cutting down on test generation time here in this instance. Some applications for this are obviously faster, cheaper assessments of explicit knowledge, software like Andy mentioned, that really helps non-experts write good tests. I could write a test, I'm not an IO, so I'm not an expert here, but using this would allow me to write something that would be valid and usable. It also allows us to do up-to-date assessments. So like Amey also mentioned, jobs change all the time in the Army. We need to be able to model that with our work. And also it allows us to use self-generated study aids. So for example, if a soldier is in training, they can use this technology to kind of make sure they have flashcards or sample tests to learn efficiently over time. And I do want to mention that we provided some multiple choice examples here. We're also working on a ton of other types of assessment developments. So for example, we've been working on situational judgment tests, which are, they give a participant a situation and then maybe some examples of what they may do in that situation. That's really good for identifying the KSVs or KSAOs or whatever acronym you want to insert there, individual differences that Amy was talking about. We've also come up with technology to write concept maps to test expert knowledge, and also multiple choice items for procedural knowledge. So we're coming up with different types of assessments to test different types of cognitive abilities for our soldiers.
Yeah. We also have projects where we're looking at developing personality tests, which surprisingly they're pretty amenable to a lot of the NLP methods. And one of the projects that has more recently started is doing creativity assessments. So how do we assess creativity in officers quickly and efficiently? Normally the tests we have require trained raters to sit down and read people's written responses and come up with some rating of creativity. But the NLP and machine learning techniques that we're using right now actually work pretty well at getting. In fact, they're even doing better than the raters. Of course, there's issues with trying to transfer those into a high stakes setting, with cheating and things like that. But they're working very well. And so we're using a lot of these techniques for a really wide range of assessments. And one of the things we're doing is we're testing different kinds of techniques to see which are more appropriate for certain kinds of data or settings or things like that.
So I do know we have about 10 minutes left. The one thing I want to touch on before I open it up for questions and discussions are just our opportunities for faculty and students. So before I mentioned the BAA, I think I might, when we get a few questions, you want to leave it on the BAA slide so they can scan the QR code and all that good stuff. I'll skip through this. Jay, what are you doing? I'm skipping this.
Keeps going.
It keeps going. I don't want that either. So we have a lot of fellowship opportunities for graduate students and faculty. So for example, if you have a Ph.D. student who might be more interested in applied work, we have a lot of opportunities for those students to learn about applied work in the Department of Defense that allow them to not just work with us, but also still work with their mentor, which I think is a really important aspect. So it still allows them, for example, to complete their dissertation, or any research projects they may have going on in their lab that they're working in now. But if they, may be more interested in, again, that applied work, we do have opportunities for them to work with us and kind of see what it's like to do our job.
And I do have to warn you that recently ARI's re-implemented a decision that our students have to come back into the office. So there's an expectation that, you have to be in the DC area, unfortunately, which we're seeing if we can work around that in different ways. But we also have postdocs, and those pay well enough that you can move.
Yep. Yeah, we have the postdoctoral fellows right down here. Again, you'll have these slides so you can look at it more in depth. And then we do have also opportunities for faculty. So we have senior fellows and sabbatical fellows in case you want to come work with us for a little bit. These are a little bit shorter appointments, but still good to touch on nonetheless. Okay, I'll actually leave it here for questions because you guys have questions. So thank you guys so much for listening to our talk. If you guys are interested in the BAA, this is the QR code for that right now. That's for the funding. It is currently going on. So if you guys are interested in seeing what research topics we are interested in, scan that code.
Is this the basic research BAA or the general?
It's a general.
Okay. Just so you know, we have two different BAAs that tend to go out from ARI. One is for our basic research program, which there isn't a set schedule that it goes out on really, unfortunately, but if you just, there's grants.gov, you can set up some alerts so that when things pop up. And actually that's open right now. The deadline for white papers has already gone past, but you can still send in white papers and they might not have time to give you feedback, but or if you have an idea, you don't have to send in white papers, you can just send in a basic research proposal, but without feedback, it's a little chancy. And then the second BA that we have is just kind of a broad BA that really covers our applied research programs. So that's a lot of things like the leadership and assessment things that we talked about earlier. And that's also on grants.gov, but it comes out on a slightly different schedule.
Yep, and just to add to one of Amy's points is a white paper is not required. So the way that we do these grant and contract kind of allocations is a call will go out, you can submit a one-page white paper typically, just telling us your idea, what you're thinking about doing, and we'll actually read it and give you feedback. That window has passed, but I will note, I talked to our colleague who's in charge of it. If they have time and you're interested, we may still be able to review a white paper. You do not need that white paper though to submit a proposal. If you're interested in submitting a proposal, all you have to do is send that to us by July 1st, and you'll be in consideration for it. Yeah, so we're happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you guys so much. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for the talk, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
Great. I guess I'll be selfish too, but is the Army with the NLP stuff, are people doing like fine tuning some of these open source transformers like Bird and Yaml? Because I feel like they can do a lot of this stuff.
Yep.
There are a few internal efforts. I would call them nascent. Mainly because the Army is still trying to decide on which kind of technology stacks and things like that to use. They'll set up like one system, based on AWS, and then they'll decide, oh no, we're going to use Azure, and then they have to transfer everything over. And trying to, she mentioned the security stuff earlier, trying to make sure that takes place on systems, where all this, the entire software stack, has been validated and approved, and it takes a little time. But yes, we are. ARI personally is not doing that work, but there are some people in the Army who are doing some fine tuning of these models.
I asked because I remember doing topic model back in the day.
Yeah, no, it's not easy.
Yeah, but it's actually kind of surprising, even though because we don't have some of these advanced tools easily available to us on the systems that we have right now, some of the, I don't want to call them old school techniques, but they work very well in some cases. They don't give us quite as much flexibility, and there's a lot of capabilities we're missing out on. But yeah, like LDA, just kind of more classic techniques are working pretty well.
Yep.
And this second one is just, what do you want to see in the future NLP kind of solve? A lot of you mentioned sort of replacing very intense human labeling, coding effort. Is there anything else you guys are interested in using NLP?
That's a good question. So for us specifically, I was in this unit when it was first being stood up, predictive analytics, and the idea that I had in my head was that I wanted to put industrial psychologists out of business. It's not going to happen, but the idea is that if we can find parts of the research chain, that are especially labor intensive, and find ways to make it a little bit faster. So as one example of things that we've done recently, qualitative coding. So you sit down, you have a bunch of notes, you have maybe some text documents, and you have train graders sitting and trying to code topics by hand. And you get really rich data. It's pretty important. But one of the things that we've done, is look at techniques for trying to use things like machine learning to help predict topics, so that if there's a list of 100 topics, people, well, maybe we'll just show them the top 10 and let them decide between those top 10. Now, in terms of general topics, like for NLP, assessment development, I see being important for a while. Let's see, the qualitative coding, I think that will be very important. So one of the things the Army has a lot of are official documents. There's doctrinal things that go on for eons, and trying to find some way to use those documents. So you mentioned fine-tuning before. One thing that I would love to be able to do is to take the entire universe of Army, field manuals and things like that, and use that in some retrieval augmented model to to help build better natural language systems. For the semantic frame stuff that she was talking about earlier, that's essentially the frames are essentially an ontology. They're sort of a cognitive semantic ontology, but trying to build these ontologies, that's actually pretty important. And that's the thing that takes a lot of time right now. So one of the things we've sort of explored is, are there ways that we can, extract these ontologies and build the ontologies in a way that doesn't take like, 6 months or a year and a computational linguist. So I don't know if you have like other areas where you think.
I actually have a little bit of a pet project that I've talked to one of the unit chiefs who's actually involved in the basic research that we talked about, where we're trying to use natural language processing on interview data to perhaps extract perhaps aspects of what they're saying that might be more predictive of things like retention or willingness to train more. So for example, one of the things I've been looking at is, can we extract different perhaps memory types from this natural language data? So depending on how they're recalling a memory, can that perhaps provide information on maybe the cognitive processes that are behind that memory? And that's like a very small example of something like this. But if we could use just a paragraph of text to say, hey, this person might be more likely to go into this type of training, or this person might be more likely to be, more of a team member, or another type of individual difference. That might be a really efficient way to save time in the assessment process. So that's like a wild out there idea, but it's been
Yeah, it's
something
more
we've been playing around.
inductive code rather than trying to mimic a human.
Right.
That's kind of,
An area where I know AI's traditionally had a lot of interest, but we haven't been able to get any, I wouldn't call them great projects yet, is in unobtrusive assessment. So I mentioned that was one of the areas that we're interested in. And so if you have like a squad, or if you have, like a headquarters unit or something like that, can we track what people are saying and in real time try to get information about the functioning of that unit to look at things like, communication quality, like your team processes. Are there, certain team processes where, the team is breaking down, or kind of in a more applied thing, like use that as to help us develop real-time criterion so that the Army does a lot of training exercises. And so, like in training exercises, they'll have things that go wrong, and people have to react to the things that go wrong. And so can we track how people are communicating and how they react to those, emergency situations, and try to identify, okay, what went wrong, how do we fix it, but in general, just trying to use that for like unobtrusive assessments. Like I think there's a big interest there, but finding the right combination of like sensors and technologies has been a little hard so far.
All right, we have any more questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.